Well, welcome to you, David, in Dunedin from the University of Otago University. Diana down in the wilds of Invercargill, thespian and youth educator in the past. Mm-hmm. Fiona, Fee from the Diocese of Brisbane. Good to have the three of you on board. We've got, I think, a very invigorating passage, the stuff about bickering disciples and also this powerless image of the child. David, tell us about what's going on in this little passage from Mark.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, there's a lot going on. We've almost got two separate passages which have been put together, quite different in some ways, but they work well alongside each other to illustrate a contrast between Jesus's priorities, which is the first focus in 30 to 32, and then the disciples' priorities in 34 onwards. So we've got two slightly different stories, but they work well together. The first one is passing through Galilee, where Jesus again foretells. It's not the first time. He's again telling the disciples about his death and resurrection. The second one is actually in the village of Capernaum, and this is where the disciples are bickering. They want to know who's the greatest, and Jesus uses the child to teach them. So we've got a contrast here between Jesus is focused on what's ahead, and he's trying to teach, and the disciples are focused on more immediate concerns, status and arguing. Now, in terms of the context of the text, where does this come? This is now early in the second half of Mark's gospel. So it's part of this shift in the second half of the gospel towards Jerusalem. Physically, of course, they're still in Galilee, in the north of the country, but it's clear, particularly in the first little sequence, verses 30, 31, 32, that the focus is very much on Jerusalem. That's where Jesus's mind is. One thing to be aware of in terms of what's happening around this, that the passage is following on from the healing of the boy with a spirit, which in turn comes after the transfiguration. So that's what the sort of immediate context before is. And then just finally a word on geographic context. Capernaum on the north shore of Galilee is, of course, the village where Peter, Andrew, James and John are from, as was shown in chapter 1. And it's where Jesus has already spent some time healing and teaching there. And possibly it's because the group are going back to Capernaum in this second half of this passage, that might be the factor that triggers the bickering, that they're sort of going back to hometown, and maybe that's something which is involved with this. Or possibly it's because it's coming so soon after the transfiguration, when only 3 of the disciples went up the mountain, and maybe that's what's on the disciples' minds. So that's a little bit of geographic context that perhaps helps us understand it.
Okay, that's a lovely opening, and I find that challenging. Diana, give me your sense of the challenge of this passage.
Yeah, I think it is a really challenging one because I think that we can all in some way feel that point where those people are bickering about things about wanting to be that best person, that achievement sort of idea. So you can feel kind of bad really for the disciples at that particular point, because I'm like, well, you see it every day, people are in the same sort of format, it happens. But it was really interesting to be challenged with that even the best of us, Jesus' disciples, need to learn the art of being humble. And that while it is good to be industrious and ambitious, we shouldn't forget that the risk of forgetting obedience and service to God, that needs to come first. There was a quote that I read and I thought it was really lovely, and it's true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. And I thought that was really, really lovely, because it's sort of saying to us, hey, it's not saying, that you should forget yourself entirely, especially with everything talking about self-care and looking after yourself in this time. It's not saying that at all. And that's not the message that Jesus is trying to put across. But it's saying, actually, we need to learn to put others first and to be thinking of others as well, and to just, really give them a hand.
So you're telling me that we're not ourselves the centre of the universe. Thanks, Diana. Ruined my evening. Fiona, what about you in the wilds of Brisbane there? Where's the challenge for you?
Well, one of the things I love about this passage is just how obviously the disciples haven't got it yet. And one of the things that Jesus has just laid it out, he said, I will die at the hands of humans. This is not going to be a triumphant ending the way that our people have expected for generations. This is something that is going to be devastating, but I will rise again. And for me, they seem to have completely skipped this. They did, the passage says, but they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask. And I was heartened by that, because we've all been in that situation where if we ask, we're afraid to ask a question because it might show just how much we've missed already. Our ignorance might display the hollowness of our understanding. But you would have thought that the disciples would have picked up on this, but I will rise again, and said, hey, what? It's one thing to think they're not getting the Messiah they expect, but it's another thing to miss that clue that everything will be turned on its head. And so for me, it's sort of encouraging that the disciples are getting it so clearly stated, and yet they're still not getting the fact that there's just nothing in their experience of the expectation of Messiah to make the connections in their heads that this is the Messiah in action, that there will be humility and despair involved, but ultimately the end result is triumph of a different sort. And the second thing is, of course, then it shows the next bit where they're arguing who's greatest. It just shows they're not on the same page.
David, talk to me about a sense that you find personally challenging, perhaps, when you encounter this.
Well, I think that the points Fiona were making are for me some of the biggest challenges here. Another challenge I find personally is wondering, well, how much does Jesus himself know at this point? That the way it's presented in the text is very confident that he has full knowledge. It's like he's almost watched the TV sequence before. He knows what's going to happen. It's that sort of image. I'm aware of others who argue, no, this is Markan theology, which is being projected into the text. That's why he knows it all, because Mark knows it and is filling in the gaps in retrospect. I can recognize both of those, and I suppose not knowing with certainty, it seems to me entirely reasonable to assume that Jesus would know what any savvy person should know in that situation. If you're going to Jerusalem and you're proclaiming the kingdom of God, you are likely to run into resistance. That much should be known to anyone. Again, it's extraordinary the disciples don't seem to have the awareness of this that they might. Whether he knows more than what a savvy person should know in that situation, people will have different views on, but I think it's one of the challenges of the text here.
Okay, so it's going to, at a purely human level, end up pretty unpleasantly. So where's the good news, Fiona?
So there is hope in this passage, and that is that Jesus goes on to reteach the point that there is something at the end. It's just possibly different from what everyone's expecting. The fact that they didn't ask the obvious questions is okay, because we can ask those questions. If we were in that situation, what would we have asked? So I actually wrote out how that conversation might have gone. So Jesus, what kind of Messiah lets themselves get killed? And Jesus says, well, one who's going to live again. I've already told you that. And then they could say, well, what kind of life is this? And then Jesus could say, it's the kind of life where I emerge and say, peace be with you to the people who killed me. It's very sort of Girardian flipping of the narrative processes that have been going on for decades and histories and centuries. So for those people who killed me, there is hope. For people who walked with me, there is hope. Through my re-emergence, there is hope. I think it's there in the subtext, and I think Mark probably wants us to imagine what questions would have been asked.
Diana, this good news. I mean, Fiona's offered us something pretty profound there.
When I looked at it and thought about the idea of the disciples not potentially understanding, I thought, what if it's meant to be that way? Jesus will often talk about that you can't know all, and that sometimes we are not meant to know. So maybe the way in which this is said, even though it is very, very clear to us reading it, maybe it's a point that the disciples are just not meant to get at this particular point in time. Hence, this conversation may happen, and would it make it any clearer? Would it change the events of what is about to happen? Potentially not. But I think it's interesting to see that God can be working in any situation regardless of the knowledge that you have. And so even though you may try and feel prepared for things, as Jesus was trying to prepare his disciples, if that just goes, as long as you still have faith as your base, then everything will happen the way it is meant to have happened.
Yeah, and we haven't got to the cross yet, and Mark's very clear about that. David, good news.
I think it's as others have said, that there is this reversal of values, which is surprising good news. We're perhaps not expecting the reversal of values to be good news, or certainly the disciples aren't in their argument about who's greatest. But that's the message which is coming on. Here he's illustrating with the infant child. He's holding in his arms, saying, as you have welcomed one such child, so you've welcomed me, and also the one who sent me. And I think some of the connection is to the notion of the reversal of values that Jesus is illustrating in the child, and that's the reversal of values of crucifixion going with resurrection. That nobody expects the horror of crucifixion to then be followed by the joy of resurrection. And there's a similar reversal going on in talking about the welcoming of the child.
Diana and Fiona, I'm going to ask Diana first, but working with children, they're vulnerable. Does that influence your interpretation of the passage?
There's a theology here of a love theology. And I think that's very clear when we're talking about the way that we are with children, because it comes in this idea of care and protection. While at this time, children would have been seen as second-class citizens. So it was therefore pretty incredibly important that Jesus showed that you not just to treat children well, but you actually have to teach them the ways as well, so that they can treat others the way in which you treat them. And I think this is really important when you're thinking about children in our churches and children in ministry. Important to note that children's ministries should never be regarded as less important than those of adults, that it's just as important to work as also having that childlike trust in God, that as adults, sometimes we do need to step back into the child roles of how children are. They're very honest, they're very open, they don't worry so much about other people's perceptions, and they're amazingly spontaneous and confident and show strength in ways that sometimes us adults wish we could go back to. And so I think that childlike trust in God is something that's also put forward here.
But there's two dimensions there that you brought up which are very, I think, central to this passage. Fiona, child?
I'm a high school teacher in my past, but also I've worked with primary school students. I think the child would have asked the question. So we see the disciples balking at showing their ignorance and showing their confusion, but a child would have just said, why? What? Why? And demanded that the responder continue through to the logical conclusion. I think that honesty, intellectual honesty, is a particular type in childhood that we have to try very hard to recreate in adult life.
Okay, so David, to wrap up, there is good news. How is it good news? So what is it for our society today?
I think it is showing how for adults, engaging with difference, engaging with otherness can be a profoundly liberatory learning experience. I suspect that the disciples were not interested in the children in the house, or at least the child in the house. Jesus focuses on the child, and there's a really important message that he draws out from the child, which shows how childish actually the disciples have been in their focus, and how in a much better way they could learn from an actual child what's important in life.
Thank you very much. So from bickering to the centrality of the child, you've broken open some pretty important scriptures here. David, Diana, Fiona, thanks for being on board.